An SOS at NPR and PBS. President Trump has signed an executive order directing the Center for Public Broadcasting to end federal funding for the nation's two largest public broadcasters. The heads of both organizations have been pushing back.
This is probably the most difficult and serious threat in the time that I've been in public broadcasting, this idea that funds that had already been put aside for public broadcasting would be taken away.
20% of Americans live in an area without any other local news coverage other than their local public radio station. This is tremendously important as a public service. And just because not every single person uses it every day, I don't drive on our interstates every day, and yet when I need it, it's there.
All right, let's go to CNN's Hadas Gold in New York. Where do things stand this morning, Hadas?
Well, this was expected. This has been expected to come for a long time, but there is a lot of concern and a lot of questions and statements about, is this even lawful? This executive order came out late at night, and President Trump wants to claw back already congressionally allocated funding, and he's accusing these outlets of producing biased radical coverage. He called it left-wing propaganda. And I should note, this sort of desire to claw back this funding is not new. If you remember, Mitt Romney in the 2012 election had this whole thing against PBS and Big Bird. Now, I do want to note here that the Corporation for Public Broadcasting disperses more than $535 million to public radio and television stations. This helps fund your local NPR station. It helps fund PBS programs. If your kid watches Daniel Tiger and Dinosaur Train like my 4-year-old does, then this will affect those programmings. Now, as we saw earlier on that full screen, federal funding isn't important, but it's a small part of their overall funding. For NPR, 1%, this is the national level, receives their funding from direct federal funds. The local stations, they get affected more, 8 to 10%. PBS gets 15% from direct federal funds. Now, we are hearing some pretty strong statements from these organizations that were directly affected. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting putting out a statement saying CPB is not a federal executive agency subject to the president's authority. They also note that Congress directly authorized, when they passed the law establishing it in the 1960s, funded CPB to be a private, nonprofit corporation wholly independent of the federal government. PBS came out and called it blatantly unlawful, saying this order was just issued in the middle of the night. And NPR noted that this will have a devastating impact on the American communities across the nation who rely on this, especially places like the Midwest and the South and people who rely on local public radio stations. I do think, though, Pam, we should expect some legal action on this. CPB is already establishing legal action because President Trump tried to fire 3 of their board members. Pam.
All right, Hadas Gold, thanks so much.
It is no secret that Donald Trump has done more to target traditional media companies than perhaps any other modern American president.
Yeah, now he's taking aim at America's 2 biggest public broadcasters. The U.S. president signed an executive order asking the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB, to end direct federal funding for NPR and PBS.
The White House accuses the broadcasters of spreading, quote, radical woke propaganda disguised as news. The CBP was set up by Congress as a private entity to prevent government interference.
CNN's chief media analyst Brian Stelter joins us now for more. Brian, first of all, just remind us of the role that these 2 entities, PBS and NPR, play for millions of Americans at home, and the significance then of this executive order from the president.
Yeah, there are 1,500 local radio and TV stations in the United States that receive funding from the federal government, from taxpayers. In some cases, it's a small amount of the budget. So think about big blue cities, big urban areas with lots of donors, lots of foundations. Those sorts of stations would survive if federal funding was suddenly stripped away. But smaller stations, more rural stations, especially in Republican strongholds, would be the ones to suffer the most and would probably go off the air. I interviewed the head of the PBS or NPR affiliates in Alaska, for example. He said it's the smaller stations that will suffer if this actually goes through. Thinking about this in a global sense, in many Western democracies, the funding of radio and TV is a point of pride. But in the U.S., it's been a source of contention for many decades. Republicans in the U.S. have long said they wanted to defund NPR and PBS, but they've never been this close to actually doing it. Trump is pushing much harder to actually get it done, even though these funds have been allocated by Congress every single year. Today, PBS and NPR leaders are saying this is unlawful. Trump cannot actually strip the funding. His executive order essentially has no teeth. Here's what the head of PBS, Paula Kerger, said in a statement this morning. She called the order patently unlawful, and she said it threatens our ability to serve the American public with educational programming as we have done for the past 50 plus years. You'll see at the end of the statement, she is threatening legal action, and NPR is doing the same thing. They are going to go to court, I believe, to try to protect their rights and their funding. I've been noticing my media beat is fast turning into a legal beat because so many different media outlets are going to court trying to defend themselves against President Trump's actions. Earlier this week, Trump claimed he was firing 3 board members of the organization that oversees this funding for PBS and NPR. It's called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It's one of those invisible parts of the United States, that just takes care of sending out these monies. Well, the thing about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is it's not a government agency. It's a private entity. Congress set it up that way specifically to protect it from a moment like this. So we continue to see these cases where Congress sets aside the money, but now Trump is trying to claw it back. It keeps happening to different media outlets, and we don't know what will happen in this case.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting is pushing back on President Trump's executive order to end funding for NPR and PBS. CPB's president and CEO says Trump just doesn't have the authority to direct the board to make those cuts. The CPB disperses about $500 million, or just over $1 per taxpayer a year, to public radio and TV stations and to programming. They provide access to popular kids shows, news programs, emergency alerts. Joining me now is Vivian Schiller, former president and CEO of NPR. She's now vice president and executive director at the Aspen Institute, and also once led our documentary and long-form units here at CNN. Nice to have you with us this afternoon. So when we look at where things stand here too, I was struck, the CBP pushing back, saying, look, you don't have the authority to do this. In the executive order, it reads, unlike in 1967, when the CPB was established, the order says, today, the media landscape is filled with abundant, diverse, and innovative news options. Government funding of news media in this environment is not only outdated and unnecessary, but goes on to say it is corrosive to the appearance of journalistic independence. That really stood out to me. What do you make of that language?
Oh, well, first of all, there's a whole bunch of things going on in what you just read.
True.
First of all, the White House does not have the authority to defund CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It's not a federal agency of the executive branch. It was created by Congress, and the funding comes from Congress. Congress can defund CPB, and in doing so, of course, defund public radio and public television, but that wouldn't happen immediately. So basically, the president does not have the authority to do what he's stating in this executive order. As for the media environment today and whether it's different than the 1960s, of course it is, and yet millions of people across the country, including and especially in rural areas, many of them in red states, rely on public radio and they rely on public television for that content. It's free, it's over the air. Not everybody has cable or satellite. And so that is still a very important mechanism into communities all over the country.
To your point, it's critical. It's critical. I know we keep saying this when it comes to emergency alerts, but also it's critical in terms of local reporting, which there's less and less of today, right? Holding local officials to account, making sure that people know what's happening in their districts. The percentage is maybe fairly small when people look at it in terms of the federal funding that goes to a number of these stations, but could they survive without it?
Well, some yes, some no. So just talking about public radio and NPR right now, NPR will survive without it. NPR, the funding that NPR gets directly from Congress, from CPB, is very, very small. However, they do get funding from the stations. The stations, which get more funding, on average 10% of their funding from CPB, they pay NPR to license programs like Morning Edition and All Things Considered. So some of those local stations, because that average of 10%, that includes the fact that big urban public radio stations get very little from CPB, but small rural stations are very reliant on that government funding. So many of those would have to shut down, or they might or they might have to consolidate. They will provide less relevant local reporting to those communities. And of course, less money will be going to NPR. So there will be a shrinking of the system. Will it die? Absolutely not. But there will be a shrinking of the system, including in communities that need it most.
We're really tight on time, but I'm just curious your take. I mean, this is whether or not this goes through, right? What it does is it creates a narrative. It creates a narrative, multiple narratives. But the president has long pushed back against NPR, against PBS. What does that do overall in terms of the credibility of these organizations? How harmful is this?
I don't think the White House's attack will particularly harm people who have been reliant on NPR or PBS programming for a long time. But this is part of an overall narrative of attacking a free press, an independent free press that reports on things that maybe the president doesn't like. I mean, this is one of many examples. You've covered them amply on CNN. And I will also say this is not the only way that they're going after public radio and public television. There's a whole bunch of other things that they're doing too, and trying to fire trustees of CPB and other kinds of cuts and legal attacks.